Hello, everyone, and welcome into another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Wednesday, November 13th around here, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking about those CFP rankings that came out yesterday. We'll break down the rankings, we'll break down the bracket, and I'll give a couple of takeaways from the first couple of weeks of the way the committee seems to be thinking, at least as of right now. Then we'll get into a little bit of a big game breakdown. Pitt and Clemson, a huge game in the ACC. A downright elimination game in that conference. We'll break it down on today's show. Then we'll get into the upset alert previews in the SEC. I wanted to get into Texas at Arkansas, as well as LSU heading over to Florida. Both teams really trying to get that win, and if they don't, I think both of them are out of the CFP race. Then we'll get into the upset alerts all around the country. We have Notre Dame, SMU, Oregon, and a couple others that are definitely in a little bit of a precarious spot going into this week. And then we'll finish it off. We'll get into some questions as we head into this week, including, are there a number of teams that can get knocked out of the CFP race this year, and what are those teams to be watching for this week? But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have fun back and forth here, is to use that super chat. At the bottom of the chat on the Sports Network page, there is a $sign. Click that, add any question, comment you'd like. It'll pop up on the screen, and we can have fun back and forth here. Definitely want this to be as interactive as possible, especially as we have to deal with all of the tiebreakers and all of the craziness that is about to come over the next couple of weeks. But let's go ahead and jump into these rankings, because the rankings came out yesterday, and there are some things that I don't necessarily love. There are some things that I do love. So we'll break it down real quickly here, and we'll start with this first 13 teams, the 25 to 13, right before you get into the playoff field. And Tulane makes their appearance into the field, and I think that gives you an idea of exactly the pecking order in the G5. It is going to be Boise State likely. I think Army being this low is pretty tough for them. I think it does leave the door open for a 12-1 Boise State to get in over a 13-0 Army. Now, maybe the 13-0 Army would just take Notre Dame's spot, so maybe both of them would get in, but it is a tough spot for Army to be in. If they climbed up to maybe 21-20, I think I'd feel a little bit better, but definitely in a precarious position for Army to be in. But Tulane's right there, so I think it's telling you that Boise State goes 12-1, they're in. If Army goes maybe even 12-1 and Boise State loses another, maybe they're in from the American. If Tulane wins out and wins the American, they're probably in at 11-2. So a little bit of craziness around the G5, but I think this gives us a good idea of what the pecking order is. It's going to be one of those three teams if I had to imagine at the end of the day. Missouri wins and stays in. They do have a ranked matchup now this upcoming weekend against South Carolina. Going to be a huge one, and definitely one that they badly need to win. I've said time and again that I think even if they win out, they're probably not in a good position, but at the end of the day, they do play South Carolina, who probably should be flipped with LSU, but that's neither here nor there. It's a very interesting system they got going on in that room. But Washington State keeps that dream alive at 18. They're still alive, but I wouldn't expect much here. I think about a million things have to happen, frankly. I think they'd probably go with a 3-loss South Carolina before they go with a 1-loss Washington State. I'll be totally honest, and we'll see what happens with that, but I still think even at 8, even 6 spots out of the field, I wouldn't feel great about Washington making that run. Kansas State stays above Colorado. I think that makes sense. Doesn't necessarily matter, as we've talked about. Probably going to be whoever wins that Big 12 title that makes it into it. So not necessarily super concerned about where all these teams stack up. The big one question is Kansas State, Colorado. Let's say they go on and win the conference, and Boise State continues on winning. Do they get that 4th spot? Instead of a Big 12 champion, does Boise State get it? I'd be a little bit surprised. I think they're probably going to tip the scales just enough to give it to the champion of that conference if it is a Colorado or if it is a Kansas State, but definitely something to watch as they're still below Boise State, who is in the field. They're just ranked number 13 as of right now. SMU being this low is a little crazy to me. I'll be totally honest. I thought this was a little bit low for my taste. I think they're a team that is still firmly in a pretty good position. As you head into the back end of the ACC, I think Miami being above them, being in the top 10 is a little wild, because when you look at the two resumes, very similar, but the one loss for SMU is much better than the one loss for Miami. So it's a battle back and forth. I'm not necessarily freaking out over it by any means. I think I would still like Miami to win the conference, so not necessarily angry that they're the top team, but definitely something that I probably would have flipped that just a little bit if I'm being totally honest. So those are kind of the big takeaways from the bottom of the party. Clemson's still very much in the hunt if they win this weekend. You also have Louisville right there, right on top of them. So definitely a team to watch. They have an interesting one this weekend, so we'll keep you up to date with all of those. But definitely a lot of these teams right here are probably going to fall out this weekend, whether it's the loser of the Missouri-South Carolina game, or maybe LSU falls, maybe Louisville falls, Clemson falls, whatever that looks like. There will be a number of teams from this group that end up getting just knocked out of the conversation this upcoming week, whether it's them losing or just too many teams in front of them winning. It's going to happen, so we'll keep you up to date with all those teams as that unfolds. And then you got the top 12. And Georgia, although they are number 12, they are not in the field because of the Boise State auto bid. They are not in the field, even though they're ranked number 12. So that's something to keep in mind there. But Ole Miss jumping only to 11 is kind of interesting to me. I thought they would bump up just a little bit more. I think them and Bama possibly could have jumped a little bit above Miami. I think if you put Miami down at 11 and then pop those two teams up, I would have very little problem with that. Now, I understand why they did it the way they did. Alabama, Ole Miss has the two losses, so not necessarily going against it too aggressively there, but definitely something that I don't necessarily love. Notre Dame, Tennessee, and BYU, they benefited from the losses in front of them. Definitely a huge boost for them. I think Indiana staying below Penn State is a little bit telling in the Big Ten. Shows you that there is a very clear pecking order, and when there's a team that they feel is infinitely, or not infinitely, but is comfortably better on the field than the other, the record doesn't go out the window, but is ranked a little bit less important. And that's just kind of spattering around this entire thing. And it seems that Texas at number 3 has been a sticking point for some people, and I totally get it. No doubt about it. It's not the best resume at by any means. Probably the best win on the schedule was Vanderbilt on the road or Michigan on the road. So totally understand why people are so upset about that. I do think the talent, I think the upside, and I think not having a terrible loss, although that Georgia one got a little bit ugly, it's obviously not a terrible, terrible loss like some of the other teams have behind them. And also, something to keep in mind is it seems like the committee is taking into account how you did in those games. Texas only played one game that was within about 19 points, other than that Georgia loss and that Vanderbilt game. That was the only other game that was within 19 points of their win. So they are taking care of business, and they're doing it in a way that is fairly impressive. So they stay at number 3, and the top 2 is unchanged, and that makes total sense. And then we'll see what happens with Indiana. If they can get a win next week, then obviously they'll shoot up into that group. But overall, I think the rankings were a little all over the place. The criteria is a little bit unknown to me at this very moment, but at the end of the day, I do think it makes for some great matchups and a really fun bracket, and we'll get into that right now. So Oregon, Texas, Miami, and BYU, those would be your auto bids. Those would be the teams that you're looking at. I'm sorry, BYU is the 3, Miami is the 4. Apologies for that, but definitely something to watch as we get into this. It's going to be really interesting to see how all of this plays out. But the first round matchups, you get Notre Dame, Tennessee, and Neyland. That's going to be absolutely incredible to watch. Cannot wait to see what that unfolds like. And obviously, we'll see what happens with these two teams. If Tennessee loses this weekend, this will change in a hurry. But at the end of the day, the hypothetical of this one is downright special. Then you have Alabama going up to Bloomington to play a playoff game. I can't imagine that's something that anyone had on their bingo card as we got into this year, but Indiana's played some great football, and they absolutely deserve to be a host team right now, and we'll see what happens after that Ohio State game. We'll see if they fall below that 8 line and obviously move into the going on the road to play one of those games. That's probably what I would expect, but we'll see what happens there. Then you have Penn State Ole Miss, a really interesting one. You have the Rebels going up to Happy Valley. Going to be a fascinating one to watch, no doubt about that. Ole Miss would technically have probably the athleticism, the playmakers on the outside that would be really special to watch. The question is, it would be December in Happy Valley. So what would the weather be like? And that also applies to Bloomington. What would the weather be like? And would Ole Miss or Alabama be able to handle that? Would be really interesting. And then you do have Ohio State, Boise State. That's one that has stayed the same over these last 2 weeks and would be a really interesting one to watch. Ashton Genty against some of the hard-hitting guys on that Ohio State defense would be a sight to behold, no doubt about that. And then in the second round, you could get, Oregon Notre Dame, you could get Oregon Tennessee, or Ohio State BYU, or Boise State BYU would be a fascinating matchup in the quarterfinals of the playoff. You would have Ole Miss Miami, which would be high flying offense, or Penn State Miami, kind of a battle of styles. Alabama Texas, we've seen that last couple of years, been amazing. Or Indiana Texas, could be up and down the field, really fun, explosive plays all over the place. So really like this bracket. I mean, every time it pops up, it's always really fun to look at. The rankings, a little bit harder to get an idea of, and let's get into that here for a second, because the committee, we've been able to see 2 rankings as of now, and we got to get to some takeaways of what they're looking at every single week. The biggest thing to me that has kind of stood out is the way these rankings seem to work, and I don't necessarily love that this is the way it's working, but at least from face value, what it seems to be is they're going to value, are you undefeated? Do you have 1 loss? Do you have 2 losses above all else? That is going to be the way that they rank teams just in general. Now, there is some exceptions, like Penn State being over Indiana, or Texas being at number 3 instead of someone like Tennessee. There are some exceptions there. It seems to be the exception is just eye test. Which team do you feel like is just outright better, would win on a neutral field? And they obviously feel that way with Texas. They obviously feel that way with Penn State over Indiana, and even South Carolina over LSU. They seem to feel that way with how they've been playing lately. So definitely really, really interesting to kind of watch that unfold. But I don't necessarily love that it's just, if you're undefeated, congratulations. You're going to be up in the top 6. If you have 1 loss, you'll probably be somewhere in that 8 to 10 range or 8 to 12 range, and then everyone else will kind of fill in the rest of the way. I don't necessarily love it. I'll be totally honest. I tend to believe that it'll kind of work itself out throughout the next couple of weeks, but definitely something to watch. And then I think the chances of 2 G5 teams is all but dead. Now, I do think if Army were to win out the rest of the way, Boise State were to go 12-0, maybe Army takes Notre Dame's spot, but then I think Army or Boise State in that scenario would be then competing with a 10-2 Tennessee, or a 10-2 Ole Miss, or 10-2 Alabama, maybe even a 10-2 Texas at the end of the day. So it's going to be really interesting to watch that unfold, and I think it could come out on the wrong side for them. So I'd be surprised if we get more than 1 G5 team in. I think the rankings have shown us that, with the 2 other teams in the G5 being at 24 and 25 in these rankings. So definitely something to watch here. The other thing I'm noticing is if you're a 2-loss SEC team, as long as you are a 2-loss team that does not make the conference championship, you're probably not going to host a playoff game. Now, there might be some wiggle room up to that 8 spot, who knows, but at the end of the day, it looks as of right now, Tennessee's cutting it off at that 8 spot. I'd be surprised if a Bama at 10-2, or an Ole Miss at 10-2, or a Georgia at 10-2 could find their way into a host position. Now, things would get interesting. If Bama were to make it to the SEC championship, I think then they could. So there's a little bit of wiggle room there, but it does seem like the SEC teams that already have 2 losses probably going to have a pretty tough time getting up to that host place unless they get into the SEC title. So as you can see, the SEC bias is going crazy in the CFP rankings this time around, but I'll actually get into that tomorrow because a lot of people are going crazy for really no reason. But finally here, I think I'm still nervous about 11-1 Indiana. If they go 11-1, I feel a little bit better about where they are now comparative to last week, but they're in a tough spot. And also, them jumping BYU and Tennessee in this one or BYU and Indiana, jumping Tennessee in this ranking doesn't make much sense to me. I think they were just righting a wrong from last week, so more power to them, I suppose, that they're above them. But definitely something to watch. It feels like, as of right now, the way it goes is, what is your win-loss record? And then if it's really, really close, you have, what do you look like on the field? And then you go down the list and you try to figure out all the other metrics and things. So it's been interesting to watch all of this unfold, and I'm not sure if we're going to have a good beat on it next week when all of this stuff unfolds. But at the end of the day, we get a little bit closer to that final product. We get a little bit closer to this 12-team playoff. And every time you see the bracket, it gets a little bit more real, a little bit more exciting. So really fun rankings, definitely ones that I have some issues with here and there, but overall, I think it'll be worked out over the next little bit, and we will break it down as it does. But let's take our first break here, and when we come back, we got to talk about Pitt Clemson, a huge game in the ACC, and one that will downright eliminate someone from the CFP and the ACC race. So we'll break it down right after this.